Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness so pure that it defied every natural instinct? Have you ever seen love transcend the boundaries that separate species, creating bonds that shouldn't exist but somehow do? In the remote highlands of Kenya, near the Maasai Mara, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything we think we know about maternal instinct and the power of unconditional love. When wildlife photographer Sarah Mitchell first spotted the mother cat nursing what appeared to be her own kitten, she almost didn't look twice. But as her camera lens focused, she realized she was witnessing something that would leave scientists baffled and her own heart forever changed. The small, domestic tabby wasn't feeding her own offspring. Instead, curled against her warm belly, drinking her milk and purring with contentment, was a tiny leopard cub, no more than 3 weeks old. This wasn't a temporary arrangement, this wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act of adoption that flew in the face of millions of years of evolution. The tabby cat, later named Kesi by the local Maasai community, had somehow found this orphaned leopard cub and decided to raise him as her own. But what made this story truly remarkable wasn't just the initial rescue. It was what would happen 8 years later, when the roles would reverse in the most beautiful and heartbreaking way imaginable. The morning Sarah first witnessed this impossible scene, mist was rising from the acacia trees, and the African sun was painting the savanna in shades of gold and amber. She had been tracking a pride of lions for National Geographic, hoping to capture images of their hunting patterns, when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. What she saw through her telephoto lens would become one of the most documented and debated wildlife phenomena of the decade. Kesi, a small tortoiseshell cat with distinctive white patches on her chest and paws, was grooming what she initially assumed was an unusually large kitten. The creature's spots were clearly visible, its ears slightly rounded, and its tail already showing the characteristic thickness of a big cat. Yet here it was, completely at peace, nursing alongside what appeared to be Kesi's own biological kitten, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. The local Maasai elders would later tell Sarah that Kesi had appeared in their village 3 months earlier, pregnant and seeking shelter. They had welcomed her, as was their custom with animals in need, providing her with food and a safe place to give birth. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. Sarah Mitchell had spent 15 years documenting wildlife across 3 continents, but nothing had prepared her for what she was witnessing in this remote corner of Kenya. At 38, she had built her reputation on patience and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate animal behavior. Her weathered hands, scarred from countless hours in the field, gripped her camera with the steady confidence of someone who had learned to capture life's most fleeting moments. The assignment that brought her to the Maasai Mara was supposed to be straightforward: document the seasonal migration patterns of wildebeest and their predators. She had been staying in a small research camp about 12 kilometers from the nearest Maasai village, waking each morning before dawn to position herself at various watering holes and game trails. The work was solitary, demanding, and exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn her to wildlife photography after leaving her corporate job in London. Sarah's equipment was spread across the floor of her canvas tent: multiple camera bodies, an array of telephoto lenses, and notebooks filled with behavioral observations written in her precise handwriting. She had always been methodical, documenting not just images but patterns, times of day, weather conditions, and the subtle environmental factors that influenced animal behavior. This attention to detail had earned her recognition in National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and dozens of scientific journals. The morning she first encountered Kesi and the leopard cub, Sarah had been following what she believed to be a leopard trail. Fresh paw prints in the red earth near a seasonal stream had caught her attention during her pre-dawn reconnaissance. Leopards were notoriously elusive, and any opportunity to photograph them in their natural behavior was precious. She had positioned herself in a camouflaged blind she had constructed from local branches and canvas, approximately 50 meters from where the trail intersected with a small clearing. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Maasai Mara in early morning was a symphony of sounds: the distant whooping of hyenas returning from nighttime hunts, the melodic calls of hundreds of bird species greeting the sunrise, and the gentle lowing of cattle from nearby Maasai settlements. Sarah had learned to read these sounds, understanding which combinations signaled the presence of predators, and which indicated peaceful grazing time for herbivores. She had been waiting in complete stillness for nearly 2 hours, her camera ready, when movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. What emerged from the tall grass was not the adult leopard she had been expecting, but something far more extraordinary and puzzling. The first time Sarah saw the leopard cub emerge from the tall grass, she assumed she was witnessing a mother leopard with her offspring. Through her telephoto lens, she could make out the distinctive spotted coat and the characteristic gait of a young big cat. But as the animal moved closer to her position, something felt wrong. The proportions weren't quite right, and there was something else moving alongside the cub that made no sense whatsoever. Kesi appeared next, a small tortoiseshell domestic cat with white markings that seemed impossibly tiny next to what Sarah now realized was definitely a leopard cub. The size difference was striking. The cub was already nearly twice Kesi's size, despite being obviously very young. Yet there was no fear, no tension between them. Instead, they moved together with the easy familiarity of a family unit. Sarah's finger hovered over her camera's shutter release, but she found herself hesitating. Years of wildlife photography had taught her to document first and analyze later, but this scene was so unprecedented that she needed a moment to process what she was seeing. The cub was following Kesi closely, occasionally bumping against her with his head in the affectionate way domestic cats show attachment to their mothers. As they reached the small watering hole at the center of the clearing, Kesi began her morning grooming routine, and the leopard cub settled beside her with complete trust. This was when Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. The cub's eyes still held the blue-gray tint of very young leopards, indicating he was probably no more than 6 weeks old. At this age, leopard cubs should still be entirely dependent on their mothers, hidden away in secure dens, nursing frequently, and sleeping for most of the day. Yet here was this cub, not only mobile and alert, but clearly bonded to a domestic cat who couldn't possibly be his biological mother. Sarah watched as Kesi began grooming the cub with the same methodical attention she would give to her own offspring, her small pink tongue working over his spotted coat while he purred with contentment. The sound of that purr, deep and rumbling even at such a young age, seemed to echo across the quiet savanna. It was a sound that spoke of complete trust, of security, of a bond that defied every scientific principle Sarah had ever learned about interspecies relationships. She finally raised her camera, her hands slightly trembling with excitement, and began documenting what she knew would become one of the most extraordinary wildlife stories ever recorded. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself returning to the same clearing every morning, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't fully explain. What she witnessed there challenged every assumption she had about animal behavior and maternal instinct. Kesi's care for the leopard cub, whom the local Maasai had begun calling Jengo, meaning building in Swahili, was nothing short of extraordinary. The daily routine Sarah observed was both touching and scientifically fascinating. Each morning, Kesi would lead Jengo to the watering hole, always walking slightly ahead but constantly looking back to ensure he was following. She had developed a specific meowing call that seemed to be exclusively for him, different from the sounds she made for her own kitten, who had sadly not survived the harsh realities of life in the wild during the second week of Sarah's observations. Jengo's response to Kesi was equally remarkable. Despite his rapidly growing size and developing predatory instincts, he treated the small cat with gentle reverence. Sarah watched through her lens as the young leopard learned to moderate his strength during play, understanding instinctively that his adoptive mother was fragile compared to him. When they groomed each other, Jengo's rough tongue would move with surprising delicacy across Kesi's fur. The nursing sessions were perhaps the most extraordinary moments Sarah witnessed. Despite the obvious physical mismatch, Kesi continued to nurse Jengo well beyond what should have been possible. Her maternal instincts had somehow triggered continued milk production, even as her own biological kitten was no longer alive to feed. Jengo, now growing rapidly and developing the powerful jaw muscles of his species, somehow understood to be gentle during these intimate moments. Sarah documented how Kesi began teaching Jengo essential survival skills, though her methods were adapted from domestic cat behavior rather than big cat hunting techniques. She would pounce on small insects and grass movements, demonstrating hunting postures that Jengo eagerly mimicked. His natural leopard instincts were clearly present, but they were being shaped and refined through Kesi's patient guidance. The local Maasai community had begun following the story with great interest. Elder Sankale, the village's most respected storyteller, told Sarah that in all his 73 years he had never witnessed such a bond between species. He spoke of it as a sign, a reminder that love transcends the boundaries humans create in their minds. The village children would sometimes accompany Sarah to the clearing, watching in silent wonder as this impossible family went about their daily routine. 3 months into Sarah's documentation, the first signs of trouble appeared on the horizon. A territorial male leopard had been spotted in the area, his distinctive paw prints and territorial markings appearing closer and closer to the clearing where Kesi and Jengo spent their days. The local Maasai rangers, led by an experienced tracker named Olakurukur, had been monitoring the situation with growing concern. Adult male leopards were known for their intolerance of young males in their territory, even their own offspring. In the wild, mother leopards would typically move their cubs to avoid such confrontations, using their knowledge of the landscape and other leopards' patterns to keep their young safe. But Kesi, despite her remarkable maternal instincts, was still a domestic cat, with no understanding of big cat territorial behavior, or the deadly serious nature of leopard social dynamics. Sarah noticed changes in Jengo's behavior first. The young leopard, now nearly 4 months old and showing the muscular development of his species, began displaying signs of restlessness she hadn't seen before. His ears would perk up at sounds too distant for human hearing, and he would often gaze toward the dense acacia forest with an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his genetic memory. During one particularly tense morning, Sarah observed Jengo responding to what she later realized must have been the distant territorial calls of the adult male. The young leopard's body language changed completely, his playful demeanor replaced by an alertness that spoke of ancient instincts awakening. He positioned himself between Kesi and the direction of the calls, his small but growing frame tense with protective instinct. Kesi, sensing her adopted son's distress, began exhibiting behavior Sarah had never seen before. The normally calm and confident cat became hypervigilant, her tail constantly twitching and her ears scanning for threats she couldn't identify but somehow understood were real. She began leading Jengo to different areas each day, as if her own maternal instincts were telling her they needed to keep moving. The Maasai elders held long discussions about the situation. Some believed they should intervene, perhaps relocating Kesi and Jengo to a safer area further from the territorial male's range. Others argued that this was nature's course and should not be interfered with, regardless of how attached the community had become to this extraordinary pair. Elder Sankale reminded everyone that Jengo was growing rapidly and would soon need to learn the ways of his own species, whether they were ready for that transition or not. The inevitable confrontation came on a humid morning in late October, when the short rains had made the savanna lush and green. Sarah was positioned in her usual observation spot when she heard the deep, guttural growl that made her blood run cold. Through her telephoto lens, she watched as a massive male leopard emerged from the tree line, his yellow eyes fixed directly on Jengo and Kesi as they drank at the watering hole. Jengo, now 6 months old and nearly 3/4 of Kesi's size, immediately recognized the threat. His body went rigid, every muscle coiled with tension, as he stepped protectively in front of his adoptive mother. The young leopard's response was purely instinctual. Despite months of domestic cat upbringing, his leopard DNA was asserting itself in the face of mortal danger. He released a sound Sarah had never heard from him before, a warning snarl that carried the promise of his species' legendary ferocity. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The adult male, a magnificent specimen weighing easily 60 kilograms with battle scars across his powerful shoulders, paused at the edge of the clearing. His territorial instincts demanded he drive away or kill this young competitor, but something in the scene seemed to confuse him. The presence of the small domestic cat, fearlessly positioned behind Jengo despite being utterly defenseless against a creature that could kill her with a single swipe, appeared to give the big cat pause. Kesi's response was perhaps the most heartbreaking thing Sarah ever witnessed. The small tortoiseshell cat, understanding on some primal level that she could offer no physical protection against this threat, began making the distress calls that mother cats use when their kittens are in danger. Her cries echoed across the clearing, desperate and piercing, as she tried to position herself between Jengo and the adult male, a futile gesture that spoke volumes about the depth of her maternal bond. What happened next defied every wildlife behavioral pattern Sarah had studied. Instead of attacking immediately, the male leopard began circling the pair, his movements deliberate and calculated. He seemed to be assessing not just Jengo as a potential threat, but the entire dynamic between the young leopard and his unlikely mother. The big cat's confusion was evident in his body language. This situation fell outside his instinctual understanding of territorial disputes. For nearly 20 minutes, this tense standoff continued. Jengo never backed down, never showed submission, though he was clearly outmatched. His loyalty to Kesi overrode his natural instinct for self-preservation, and Sarah realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of wildlife behavior. The breaking point came when the adult male suddenly lunged forward, not attacking, but making a calculated move to test Jengo's resolve. The young leopard's response was immediate and fierce. He launched himself between the massive predator and Kesi with a courage that seemed impossible for his age and size. Sarah's camera captured the moment when Jengo, barely half the weight of his opponent, stood his ground with the kind of protective fury that spoke of bonds deeper than blood. In the chaos that followed, Kesi made a decision that would haunt Sarah for years to come. The small cat darted away from the confrontation, not in cowardice but in the desperate hope that her absence would remove the territorial threat to Jengo. Her maternal instinct told her that the adult male's aggression was directed at defending his territory from competitors, and perhaps without her presence, he might accept or ignore the young leopard. But Jengo interpreted his mother's retreat differently. To the young leopard, Kesi was fleeing in terror, and every fiber of his being demanded he follow and protect her. He broke off from the confrontation with the adult male and bounded after Kesi, his powerful legs carrying him through the tall grass with increasing desperation as he called for her. With sounds that mixed leopard vocalizations with the meowing patterns he had learned from his adoptive mother. Sarah watched through her lens as the adult male followed at a distance, now more curious than aggressive. The big cat seemed puzzled by Jengo's behavior, perhaps recognizing something familiar yet strange in the young leopard's protective instincts. The pursuit continued for nearly a kilometer before disappearing into dense woodland where Sarah couldn't follow. For 3 days, Sarah returned to the clearing and found it empty. The local Maasai trackers helped her search the surrounding area, but neither Kesi nor Jengo could be found. On the 4th morning, she discovered scattered evidence that told a heartbreaking story. Tufts of tortoiseshell fur caught on acacia thorns, leopard paw prints in the mud that seemed to circle endlessly, and the unmistakable signs that Jengo had spent hours searching for his missing mother. That evening, as Sarah sat in her tent reviewing the photographs from the confrontation, she realized she had documented something far more profound than an unusual interspecies adoption. She had witnessed the moment when love revealed its ultimate truth, that sometimes the deepest act of love is letting go, even when it breaks your heart. 8 years passed before Sarah Mitchell returned to the Maasai Mara. Her career had taken her to remote corners of Borneo, the frozen landscapes of Siberia, and the dense rainforests of the Amazon. But the story of Kesi and Jengo had never left her thoughts. She had published the photographs and documentation in National Geographic, turning their extraordinary bond into one of the most celebrated wildlife stories of the decade. But questions about their fate had haunted her dreams. Iya. Now approaching 50 and with silver threading through her dark hair, Sarah had returned to Kenya on assignment for a documentary about climate change's impact on traditional wildlife migration patterns. The Maasai village had grown in the intervening years, with solar panels dotting the traditional huts and a small medical clinic that served the surrounding communities. Elder Sankale, now in his 80s but still sharp as a thorn, greeted her with the warmth reserved for old friends. On her 3rd morning back, Sarah was photographing a herd of elephants when Olakurokur, the ranger who had helped her track Kesi and Jengo years earlier, approached with excitement barely contained in his weathered features. He spoke rapidly in Ma, then switched to English, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to share news that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about the end of this story. An elderly domestic cat had appeared in the village 2 days earlier, moving with the careful deliberation of an animal whose body was failing but whose spirit remained unbroken. The villagers had immediately recognized the distinctive tortoiseshell markings, the white patches on the chest and paws that had made Kesi so easily identifiable in Sarah's photographs. But this was not the healthy, vibrant cat from 8 years ago. This Kesi was thin, her coat dull with age, and her movements spoke of an animal nearing the end of her natural life. What made her return extraordinary was not just her survival after so many years in the wild, but what had followed her to the village. The local children had been the first to spot the massive male leopard at the forest edge, his golden coat magnificent in the early morning light. But this was no threatening presence. The great cat remained at a respectful distance, never approaching the village but never leaving either, as if maintaining a protective vigil over the small cat who had once been mother to one of his kind. Sarah's hands trembled as she raised her camera, understanding that she was about to witness the completion of a circle that began with an act of impossible love. The leopard at the forest edge was unmistakably Jengo, though he had transformed into a magnificent specimen of his species. His coat gleamed with the rich golden hue of a mature male, marked with the distinctive rosette patterns that identified him as genetically superior breeding stock. His powerful shoulders and muscular frame spoke of years spent mastering the art of survival in one of Africa's most challenging environments. Yet something in his posture, in the way he held his massive head as he gazed toward the village, carried an unmistakable gentleness that Sarah recognized from his kittenhood. Through her telephoto lens, Sarah could see scars across Jengo's flanks and shoulders, evidence of territorial battles won and lost, of the harsh realities that had shaped him into the apex predator he had become. But there was no aggression in his stance now, no territorial posturing or hunting behavior. Instead, he simply watched, his amber eyes fixed on the small figure of Kesi as she moved slowly through the village, accepting food and gentle touches from the Maasai children who remembered the stories their grandparents told about the cat who raised a leopard. What happened next defied every principle of wildlife behavior Sarah had studied. As Kesi settled in a patch of morning sunlight near the village well, obviously exhausted from her journey, Jengo began to move. The massive leopard emerged from the tree line, with movements so careful and deliberate that Sarah initially thought he might be injured. But as he drew closer, she realized he was simply being extraordinarily cautious, approaching not as a predator, but as something far more complex. The villagers who had gathered to watch held their breath as Jengo stopped approximately 20 meters from Kesi. At this distance, he lowered himself to the ground in a posture Sarah had never seen from an adult male leopard, submissive, respectful, almost reverent. He began to make sounds that seemed impossible coming from such a powerful creature. Soft, chirping calls mixed with rumbling purrs, the same vocalizations he had used as a cub when seeking comfort from his adoptive mother. Kesi's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Despite her obvious frailty, she raised her head and began answering his calls with the same meowing sounds she had used during their early bonding years. The conversation that followed, conducted in a language that transcended species barriers, lasted nearly an hour. Sarah watched through her camera as years of separation dissolved in an exchange of sounds that spoke of recognition, love, and an unbreakable bond that time and distance had been powerless to destroy. What followed in Kesi's final days became the most beautiful conclusion to an impossible love story. Jengo maintained his vigil at the village edge, never approaching close enough to cause alarm, but never straying far from his adoptive mother. Each morning, the villagers would find fresh antelope meat left at the forest boundary. Jengo's way of ensuring Kesi had the finest food available, just as she had once provided for him when he was helpless and alone. Elder Sankale told Sarah that in Maasai tradition, such devotion between species was considered a sacred gift, a reminder that love transcends all boundaries. The children would sit with Kesi during her afternoon rests, and she would purr contentedly while Jengo's protective silhouette remained visible among the distant trees. On Kesi's final morning, something extraordinary occurred. As the old cat lay peacefully in the warm sunlight, breathing her last gentle breaths, Jengo approached closer than he had dared in 8 years. The villagers watched in reverent silence as the massive leopard settled just beyond the village boundary and released a sound that echoed across the savanna, a mournful call that seemed to carry all the love and gratitude of a son bidding farewell to his mother. After Kesi passed, Jengo remained for 3 days, maintaining his vigil until the burial ceremony was complete. Then, with a final look toward the village that had witnessed their reunion, he disappeared back into the wilderness, carrying with him the legacy of a love that proved maternal bonds are not defined by biology, but by the courage to love unconditionally. Have you ever witnessed love that transcends every boundary you thought existed? Have you experienced the kind of devotion that transforms both the giver and receiver? Share your own stories of unexpected bonds in the comments below, and if this tale of impossible love moved you, subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary stories that celebrate the profound connections that make life beautiful. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that remind us that family is not about blood. It's about choosing to love when logic says it's impossible.